Yeah, what should I play today? Half-Life. Sure, why not? What?
Hello everyone, Alyxx the Rat here once again, and today I want to talk about Half-Life. Half-Life is one of those games that changed everything when it released. On paper, nothing about Half-Life seems that original, especially when you just tell someone what it's about. It almost seems like a straight-up rip-off of Doom to an extent, with the exact same premise, except instead of a space station, it's a research facility. And instead of demons from hell, you got aliens. But whereas in Doom you felt like a badass ready to take on the forces of hell by yourself, in Half-Life there was an undercurrent of horror and dread that hadn't really been fully explored in shooters before, at that point anyway. A few games have done it, such as Quake with its Lovecraftian horror aesthetic and System Shock with its cyberpunk horror. But Half-Life turned everything the FPS genre had been up until that point on its head. It didn't throw you into the action right away, instead it built its first act slowly, introducing the world and setting and easing you into it before throwing you into the deep end. It also threw away the concept of levels entirely. Instead you were exploring one big environment, with levels having a seamless transition into one another. And the entirety of the game you experienced it through the eyes of a mute protagonist, with the game never taking you out of the first person perspective. On every level, Half-Life became a massive influence on the FPS genre from then on. As a kid, I always heard people talk about Half-Life, and I did get my first taste of it with a demo of the first expansion pack for it, Opposing Force. I distinctly remember the moment a headcrab zombie bursts through a glass window and comes towards you, being one of the scariest things I'd experienced in a game at that point. I did eventually get to sit down and play through the opening levels of the full Half-Life game when I visited the Cyber Cafe sometime in 2000 or 2001.
Testing. Everything seems to be in order.
Standard insertion for a non-standard specimen. Go ahead, Gordon. Slot the carrier into the analysis port.
What is he doing in there?
Nothing you need to worry about, Gordon. Go ahead.
When I reached the point where the resonance cascade happened, I unfortunately had to leave, but that moment was burned into my mind from that point on. I thought I'd lost the game or done something wrong, because at that point I was so immersed that I just didn't know what was going on. And it blew me away when you just kept going from that point on. Now, I did eventually end up buying Half-Life. myself, but before I could sit down and play through it on my own, there was one more game using the same engine that I actually played before that. And that's the game I actually want to talk about today, Gunman Chronicles.
The equipment on the station is wearing out. Must be all the asteroid dust and grit.
Gunman Chronicles came to me, as many games did back in my childhood, on a shareware CD. My memory is a little hazy on how I acquired the full version, but I distinctly remember picking up the Skyee DVD case version at a local shopping mall circa 2001 or 2002. However, we'll be looking at the Steam version of the game, because Gunman Chronicles was pretty much a standalone mod of Half-Life, even though it wasn't always meant to be. It started out as a Quake Engine Deathmatch mod, then being developed as a Quake 2 game, before finally ending up as a Half-Life mod. After Sierra showed interest in the game, it was released as a standalone game, but you could run it in Steam as a Half-Life mod. It takes place in a sort of space western setting, and it mixes sci-fi with a heavy dose of old western influences, especially with the designs of the characters and the vibe of the story. It has a strong Wild West feel to it, but mixed with very classic sci-fi elements. You're playing as Gunman Archer, who is sent to an uncharted jungle planet to investigate a signal. It turns out the signal is a trap set up by a former general who was presumed dead after a failed mission to investigate the missing science team, where almost a whole platoon was wiped out by a strange alien species. However, he very much did survive and is now looking to not only get revenge, but doing so by turning said alien species against the gunman.
I feel certain you remember me. Think back 5 years. You might recall a little scene that unfolded on Banjo Prime. Scene of a crime, I should say. You weren't even a major then. You had no authority to order the retreat, not while your general was still alive. If you'd read your science report more carefully, you'd have known that Silicon life has no chance of digesting fellow gunmen or the scientists. But you left us all to rot in the guts of those Silicon beasts.
Making your way to the science facility on the moon, you're met with an AI who is desperately trying to fend off the invading aliens using drones. She is, however, not interested in having you interfere with her battle, and at first tries to get rid of you. However, that changes when you mess up the moon's gravitation, drawing a bunch of asteroids towards it and forcing her to leave. Agreeing to form a truce with you, she downloads herself into a portable core, and you set off to face a general on what I presume to be Earth. The plot gets a little bit vague after that. In fact, a lot of stuff was cut from the game, including an entire chapter where you would have met a different alien species called the Tilikum, who were pretty much modeled after Native Americans. It would have played even more into the old Western aesthetic of the game, but it seems they ended up scrapping that entirely. Though, given how that easily could have come off as a bit culturally insensitive, I think it's for the better.
Good morning, Major Archer. The following news highlights have been custom filtered for your special interest as a courtesy of Hypercast Networks. For further information on any topic, a complete report...
Gunman Chronicles is a Half-Life mod, and playing it, that fact becomes very clear, even as a standalone game. It's one of the few things that holds it back a bit, as it features the exact same style of opening, level transition, and scripted events. And much like Half-Life revolutionized the way levels are made, Gunman Chronicles just comfortably copies that style and sends you on a seamless journey through 4 distinct environments, interjected with short in-engine cutscenes. Each area provides its own unique visual style, enemies and set pieces. At times it almost feels like a carbon copy, with several moments and set pieces almost taken verbatim from Half-Life.
Forced to its breaking point. Gunman leaders deny these speculations. Still, despite sustained...
I have encoded the barest subset of my neural magnetic patterns into this mainframe core module. Remember our agreement, Gunman. You must transport this core module to the surface and rendezvous.
Some of the levels attempt to capture some of the same horror elements from Half-Life, but not quite reaching the same level. Now, don't get me wrong, Gunman Chronicles has its fair share of tense moments, especially with stuff like this huge dinosaur stalking you, which is one of the most memorable moments from the game. Another good example is this massive drone trying to kill you, and you can't take it down because of the shield, so you need to get it into the right position and time a button press so you can fire a massive plasma beam into it. It does pick up steam a lot quicker than Half-Life. Though unlike Half-Life, Gunman puts the tutorial switches into the beginning of the campaign. I can understand why though, as the game has some rather unique gameplay features and introducing them to you in a controlled environment is pretty much mandatory. The first thing that will probably stand out to most people playing this game is the weapon customization. Almost like anything else that had come out at that point, Gunman focuses heavily on being able to customize how your guns work, giving each gun multiple functions. For instance, the pistol can be fired in 3 separate firing modes and can be fitted with a sniper attachment that allows you to turn it into a sniper rifle, which makes it a hell of a lot more useful than just as a pistol. Enemies also jib a lot and have some degree of location-based damage, meaning headshots definitely are a thing and are just as satisfying as you'd imagine. A drawback is that the game has no dedicated aiming button, so you aim by holding down the fire button, which means if you aim, you're already committed to firing a shot. It feels a bit clunky, and if the sniper wants its own weapon, that could have been fixed. Another shining example though is the Mule, which allows you to use it as a rocket launcher or grenade launcher depending on how you customize it. You can even use the ammunition as grenades, which I think is clever. By consolidating so many different functions into a single weapon, it frees up at least 2 or 3 other weapon slots and keeps the inventory from feeling cluttered, which I think was a bit of a problem with other FPS at the time, like Eradicator, which we looked at earlier, had like 15 weapon slots. You can even set the ammunition packs to act as trip mines, which I never really used, but I can imagine it would be fun in multiplayer. Technically, the biogun also counts as an explosive weapon with the right settings. The weapon uses a mix of chemicals and can be used in different ways, whether you just want to lob acid or base at your enemies or mix them together to create an explosive mix. In all honesty, Gunman Chronicles might have some of the best weapons I've ever used in any FPS. With the right settings, the shotgun becomes immensely satisfying to use. And, like, you can even use it as a rifle, able to take off enemy heads with the spread just as tight as possible. And the game's assault rifle, the mecha gun, has an almost brutally satisfying sound to it, especially when you use its alternate firing mode, which causes the barrels to spin. Both the mecha gun and the Polaris gun have an overheat mechanic though, meaning you have to be mindful of the gun's temperature or it will malfunction. With the mecha gun you can do this intentionally though, since overheating it will cause it to fire uncontrollably, but if you're fighting a big enemy you might want that anyway. You have to be careful with the Xenons though. The ones that launch projectiles will explode if you shoot them, which unleashes a whole barrage of projectiles at you. Killing them carefully is the way to go, which adds a lot of careful strategy to the combat. In fact, every enemy feels very distinct and like they mix up the combat scenario a lot. It makes combat feel extremely dynamic, and in my opinion it feels even more varied than it does in Half-Life. Although the game never mixes more than two factions, with either the bandits or the drones fighting against the Xenos, with you caught in the middle. Progression is largely linear, and you might have to solve the odd puzzle or two, but for the most part it's very straightforward, almost to a fault. You're rarely confused about where to go next, which can be a good thing, but similar to Half-Life it has the problem of not having much replay value once you played it. However, that's not to say I don't enjoy a good linear corridor tour as well. And with each area of the game feeling so distinct, and the game never spending too long in a single location, I feel the game is an enjoyable experience, and less grueling than Half-Life's campaign due to its much shorter length. To some, this might be a negative, but to me it just makes the game pleasantly short. The game's difficulty is also often balanced slightly with the abundance of health pickups, although one important thing to keep in mind is that the health stations look different for each area. So, on the first area, the jungle, they look like these face textures on the wall. How anyone are supposed to know these are health stations is beyond me, and it wasn't until years later that I learned this by complete accident. Similar to Blue Shift, you get armor for picking up armor sets, but you better get used to seeing that zero armor thing on your HUD because the game is extremely stingy with armor pickups compared to how easily you lose it.
Hey, get away from that
In certain sections you also get to drive a tank, though honestly it feels kinda underutilized, and when you do get to use it, you mostly just drive it from place to place and have to solve some puzzles to proceed, or grab gas for it. There are also turrets placed around that you can use, but these two little more than slightly mix up the gameplay a bit. There is multiplayer, with some dedicated deathmatch maps you can play on. Much like Half-Life, the multiplayer isn't really the focus of the game, but it provides an additional thing to play with some friends if you want to try out the weapons on each other in a competitive setting. Graphically, Gunman Chronicles looks alright for the time. The Half-Life engine provides the game with a lot of neat features, such as skeletal animation, physics, and transparency effects. And as usual, I prefer playing with no texture filtering, cause it gives the game a pretty cool pixelated retro look. Though, of course, when Gunman came out, Half-Life was already 2 years old, and it looks a lot like Half-Life. So these things don't exactly impress as much as when Half-Life did it. What does set it apart though is of course the setting and the style. As mentioned, each environment feels distinctly different, and the rather broad influence of styles makes for a visual blend that feels both retro and futuristic at the same time. You go from exploring this abstract looking tech lab on the moon to exploring vacant Wild West style buildings, so the variety is pretty substantial.
You helped to save my Xenome.
I really like the voice acting in the game though. Each actor provides a decent performance, especially Jim French, who would go on to voice Father Gregory in Half-Life 2 and Bill in Left 4 Dead. His performance might be what got him his role in those games, to be honest.
Survive this. The mainframe doesn't like humans, and you seem pretty human to me. Who are you?
Get out of my way. It seems I will have to save you one more time, Gunman. I am the mainframe. While you struggled and failed to reach Deck A, I have assembled a non-virtual representation of myself. I have decided to take matters into my own hands. The elevator over there will bring you back to Deck A. Eliminate all humans and xenomes in your path. I have other tasks to attend to. I will contact you after you have accomplished this.
Cynthia Jones, who was the CI, only did one more acting role, and that's a shame as she does a really good job and is pretty much synonymous with the role.
Attention, men! I have the pleasure of introducing you to this man, one of the few survivors of Banzer Prime. He knew the great general personally. The general saved him and the rest of his troops by his glorious self-sacrifice. But the general knew no gunman leaves another gunman behind. It was his duty.
Dex Manley, who voices the Gunman, is probably another recognizable voice talent. He has worked on the Star Fox series as well as the Smash Bros. Games, where he has voiced Rob 64 and Falco. There's also great sound design on the environments, with plenty of ambient noises providing a constant background hum. Especially the Moon Lab is a soundscape that sounds like how I imagine Doom's tech lab levels would sound. And the jungle levels is full of distant animal noises that gives a feel that the world is more alive than it seems. And yeah, the weapon sounds are great. You can tell a lot of care has been taken to make the gun sound as good as possible. The pistol has this very satisfying pew-pew sci-fi sound to it, and the shotgun has a nice beefy punch, and yeah, as mentioned, the mecha gun sounds brutally metallic and mechanical.
I'm ready for him. He's as good as dead. Tell the general that it's safe to take off.
There are also little noises when you customize the guns that I think are pretty neat. The music is pretty much used exactly as it was in Half-Life, with occasional tracks being played now and then, but otherwise the game is largely without music. It's decent though, with the main theme perfectly encompassing the mix of high technology and old western sensibilities, with his almost all-country sounding guitar riff played on top of a techno beat.
The armored vehicle has no protection from Kata space. If you are hit by the General's Kata cannon, you will be destroyed.
In all honesty, Gunman Chronicles is just an average game, but with a lot of great and really cool ideas, and in many ways was ahead of its time with regards to weapon customization, which is the real selling point of the game. I know seeing a remake of this game is highly unlikely, especially given Valve seems to have forgotten about the game entirely, and the only way to get it is to buy an older second-hand copy or grab the Steam mod version for free on ModDB. But this was clearly a game with a ton of potential, and the sci-fi western mix is something that remains unique to this day. At times it has a strong Star Trek vibe to it, and you can tell it draws on a fairly large variety of influences. Unfortunately, Rewolf Software never made another game after this, and they pretty much just dissolved, and several of the staff went on to work at Streamline Studios, and they're just work largely as an outsourcing studio. In the end, Gunman Chronicles is held back by the fact that Half-Life very much runs through its DNA, and it feels more like a Half-Life mod than a standalone game. And despite the original setting and the badass weapons and the short length, it doesn't really do anything original in terms of its gameplay or progression beyond those things. But if you're hungry for more classic Half-Life action, then Gunman Chronicles might just scratch your itch. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to support me and my content, you can donate using the PayPal link in the description. See you later, and take care.
your heart with my own hands, just like the... Whoa!
We have won. Gunman landing craft are approaching. I will now transfer my immeasurable sentience back into the facility computers. I have a xenome infestation to deal with. Thank you, Gunman, and welcome to my new home planet.